Thank you for coming. This is the third and last of our public events for this week. Ute Frevert was here yesterday and on Monday, and tonight we have Barbara Rosenwein to give her second and final lecture in this series. I'd like to thank Barbara very much for making time to be here. She's been with us since last Wednesday. She's been here a whole week. Has spent a lot of time not only giving public lectures, but also speaking to, working with, having endless dinners with graduate students. Spent a whole afternoon last Friday working on one-to-one basis with graduate students and early career researchers in new research on the history of the emotions, and also attended and gave feedback to a workshop yesterday morning with graduates and early career researchers. So there's been a whole panoply of events around the history of the emotions in the series, which have been really great, and I think of which a great deal of benefit has been derived by lots of different people in the university. So thank you very much to Barbara for all the time that you've put into that, above and beyond the call of duty, actually. I'd also like to thank Robert Gilday, who's been involved in arranging the series this year, and thanks to whom we were able to bring Ute Frevert over from Berlin. As always, I'd like to thank Sarah Bebb, Vicky McGuinness, and Hannah Penny at Torch for their logistical help, and also Charlotte Pegram and Natalia Burkharkova from the Weinfeld Hoffman Trust, who are here this evening. And through them, obviously, we'd like to thank Len Blavatnik, the Blavatnik Family Foundation, who fund the chair and make it possible. One very quick announcement: this is the fourth of 5 years in this cycle of this chair. Next year we'll have Simon Sharma here around the same time to talk about public history, so put that in your diaries now. We expect that to be an event which will be much in demand. For the final time this year, please join me in welcoming Barbara Rosenwein, who's going to talk about Generations of Feeling, an overview and case study, talking about a book which is now in press at Cambridge and will be out before the end of this year with the same title, Generations of Feeling. Barbara Rosenwein.
Well, thank you very, very much, James. I must say that it's been a great pleasure to meet some of the graduate students, the postgraduates, the postdocs, and fantastic experience. So thank you very much for giving me that opportunity. I also want to thank Sarah and Vicky and the Weidenfeld Hoffman Trust, the Blavatnik Family Foundation, Trinity College, and finally all of you for coming, especially on such a beautiful day. So Generations of Feeling, as James said, is the title of my forthcoming book, which will be out in November. The subtitle is History of Emotions 600 to 1700. And what we're going to hear about today is that very last bit. The word generations is meant to bring two things, at least, to mind. First of all, groups of people born around the same time, that is, of a certain generation, and also their regeneration, as it were, in new generations over time, their children, their children's children. But second, it's meant to evoke in your mind the dynamism of feelings which are generated within and across individuals and groups. The book itself has 9 chapters, plus an introduction and conclusion. Some of the chapters take a slice of chronological time and explore a few of the many emotional communities within that period. I will explain about emotional communities in a minute. Then these chapters alternate with thinner chapters on theories of emotion that appeared around the same time as the longer chapter that precedes it. Well, emotional communities, what do I mean? When I speak of emotional communities, I mean groups of people, usually, but not always, social groups that have, each within its their own emotional community, particular values, modes of feeling, and ways of expressing their feelings. They're a bit like speech communities. Let's see. That doesn't seem to work. All right. A bit like speech communities, where, as you can see in my silly sketch here, you've got the red people speaking in red language, and the red language isn't terribly well understood by the blue people speaking in the blue language, except that a few of them overlap and can understand each other. Now, speech community can be as disparate as, Hungarian and English, or it can be just simply Americans talking to British people and not quite always figuring out what the other is meaning. But a speech community. So those would be examples of two different speech communities. And then a solid, uniform speech community would be a group probably from the same region, sharing very much the same accent, the same vocabulary. So emotional communities, too, may be very close in practice to other emotional communities of their time, or they may be quite unique and marginal to, let's say, the general emotional community, the overriding emotional community. Today I'm going to talk about two emotional communities in 17th century England. They're discussed more fully in my book, in a chapter in which I also explore a few other such communities. That is, communities that are living, that are working, that are feeling around the same chronological time. But I don't claim that my book has compassed all of the emotional communities, the whole spectrum of the 17th century English emotional communities, let alone emotional communities elsewhere. So my work leaves a lot of space for other researchers to fill in if they like. And I'm inviting you, fill it in, fill this book in. In my book, the chapter on the 17th century is followed by a thinner chapter on a 17th century theory of emotions, Thomas Hobbes's discussion of what he dubbed the, quote, voluntary motions of commonly called the passions, end quote. I won't have much to say about his theory, nor will I be able to convey to you tonight very well how the emotional communities of the 17th century picked up on and repurposed some of the emotional vocabularies and norms of earlier centuries, of emotional communities in earlier centuries. But I'll do my best to suggest where it might be worth thinking about these things. Let me begin by saying something about the general paradigms that provide the lenses through which many historians view the 17th century, so you'll see where my own work fits. Dominating the historiography of this era is the old but still influential theory of Norbert Elias. Where's mine? Okay. I'm not doing too well at this. There we are. I'll learn how to do it. That postulated the civilizing process which he said was in full bloom in the 17th century. What he meant is that the emotions and impulses of the Middle Ages, which he saw as an era without emotional restraint, were now, in the 17th century, for various reasons, inhibited by the development of internalized restraints, the superego in his Freudian terminology. More recently, Norbert Elias's views have been bolstered by the dual thesis of social discipline and confessionalization, which holds that in the early modern period, church and state introduced new controls over behavior, institutions, and emotions, tamping down impulsivity, self-assertion, and emotional expression. Some historians are disputing this theory of social control and social discipline by arguing for a bottom-up approach, where the desire for social discipline is supposed to come from the people up toward the ruling class. But both groups still think that this is a period of emotional restraint, indeed, of lack of emotional expression. Only a few historians, Susan Carent Nunn for the continent and Alec Ryrie for England, are taking note of the intense emotions of the newly Protestant societies of the 16th and 17th centuries. And those historians are the ones that have cleared the path that I am going to tread in my own work, because I find Protestant England very emotional indeed, though the emotions appreciated and expressed were not necessarily those that we value and acknowledge today. The emotions of the 17th century that I'll discuss today were characteristic of two groups centered in London and highly influenced by Protestant thought. To be sure, there were many forms of English Protestantism in this period. But for our purposes, let's divide them into two kinds, one hotter than the other. The hotter sort nurtured a reformist agenda, anxious to eliminate all Catholic elements, hierarchies, ornaments, vestments, and rituals, and to foster a more active, fervent faith, an internalized faith. Let's call this the Puritan sort. The less hot was contented with the severing of the church from the Roman papacy, but accepted hierarchy and ceremony. And these are, let's say, the Anglicans. After Charles I came to the throne in 1625 and William Laud became Archbishop in 1633, the two sorts of Protestantism increasingly went their separate ways, the Anglican affirming the exalted status of bishops and the importance of communion, the Puritan focusing on predestination and godliness. The rift, as all you know better than I, culminated in the 1640s when a largely Puritan parliament ended up challenging the Anglican Church, organizing an army, and fighting royalist forces. In the next phase, Parliament organized the New Model Army, that's in 1645, won the Civil War, and now shrunken to a rump, put the king to death. The Commonwealth, which lasted from 1649 to 1660, was dominated by men like Oliver Cromwell. I guess I didn't put up a slide for him, who identified with the Puritans, tolerated barely the Anglicans, and prohibited Catholics from worshiping in public. The two emotional communities that I'll talk about today flourished in this period of revolution. I'll begin with a group that belonged to a London-based gathered church, an unofficial congregation of people we might loosely call Puritans, probably led by a man named Henry Walker. Before joining such churches, prospective members were required to authenticate their conversion by providing an oral or written narrative attesting to it. In the case of Walker's church, these were gathered together and published in a book entitled Spiritual Experiences. And this is the full title for you, Spiritual Experiences of Sundry Believers, and so on. It recorded the testimonials of 61 believers. Those testimonials were certainly reworked for publication because the compiler, whether Henry Walker or someone else, provided citations for many of the quotations from Scripture that appear in the accounts. And then, too, the narratives tend to have a similar shape and trajectory. However, that particular manipulation is useful for our purposes of discovering the emotional norms of this emotional community, because it helps to reveal those norms despite the individuals. And yet, as you will see, there are also individual voices. Individual voices, yes, but not individual names. Every narrative is attributed only to a set of initials. Many are shorn of identifying details, so that it's often difficult to tell if the narrative belongs to a man or to a woman. Of the 61 accounts, I count 24 as representing the experiences of a female, 18 of a male, and 19 I consider indeterminable. So, let's look at an example of a spiritual experience, that of a person whose initials were FP. I'll call him a man, just for ease of exposition, but he might as equally well been a woman. And this is something to note, because it's often suggested to me that women always have different emotions and express them differently from men. But that's not true in this set of sources. The women and the men are not terribly different. Of course, I have resisted the impulse to assume that if someone mentions a child, that perforce must be a woman. But it is very frequent that, as you'll see, men will, well, you won't see it because I don't have time here, but as I saw, men will talk about their children. So I feel validated in not jumping to the conclusion that everybody who speaks about a child is a woman. Anyway, FP, I'm going to call him a man. He began his account with his sins and evil thoughts. These led him to fear that he was damned. He was tempted to make away from himself, as he put it, but considered that, quote, that would not give me ease or comfort, but be the way to enter into endless miseries. He dreamt he saw Jesus lying in a grave and then rising from the dead, and that gave him some comfort. Nevertheless, tempted by the devil, he again doubted he was saved and was ready to despair. His doubts, he said, quote, caused me to weep much, and I was exceedingly troubled, and from the thoughts of the wrath that I feared, I could have wished myself a beast, a dog, or anything, because their misery would have an end. Comforted by friends and godly books, he was delivered from his former temptations, quote, to the great joy of my heart, though he continued to be plagued by some backsliding. At this point, the narrative quoted various passages of scripture, ending with proofs that F.P. had had a change of heart. For example, quote, I do love God more than anything else and desire him above all. And another quote, I have sometimes such sweet comforts and enlargements of my soul by God's blessed Spirit that I find much peace with God thereby. Well, there are lots of emotions here, but the general sequence may be summed up as on this slide. Now, emotional sequences are important because they tell us about the context of each single emotion, the emotions that gave it rise and were in turn engendered by it. Here, for example, let's say we just focused on suicidal thoughts and we didn't put it in the context of the sense of sinfulness. We wouldn't really know what the suicidal thoughts were part of, where they came from. And indeed, there are a lot of historical studies of the general feelings of despair in this period, in the 17th century, but they're not necessarily connected to the emotions that engender that sense of despair, nor the emotions that come thereafter. The sequence described, the sequence described by F.P. continued from suicidal thoughts and near despair with tears of unhappiness and fears of God's wrath. These desperate feelings, however, were alleviated by friends and books, which brought feelings of comfort and joy. And then loving God was the final emotion in the series. Well, you may say these are just formulae, they're not real emotions. But I want to suggest that formulae tell us a lot about real emotions. First, they set up individual expectations about what the proper emotion should be. Second, they themselves are not formulated out of thin air, nor are they arbitrary. Third, formulae tend to shape how people really do feel. If you don't believe that, give a smile and tell me I am really unhappy. It's hard to do that. Finally, the formulae in spiritual experiences were not so invariable as to preclude individual variation. And in a way, I'm sorry I'm giving you an example of two emotional communities, because if I could dwell just on this one, you'd see how absolutely rich it is with some absolutely fantastic testimonials. But I'll give you another variation anyway. A woman, and we know she was a woman, known as D.M., became aware of her sins because of external afflictions. Her husband, whom she said she had loved too much, went away from her, which I take to mean he abandoned her rather than he died. When she recognized her sinfulness, she was terrified, certain that she was damned. Quote, I feared that God did not love me. As a result, quote, "This wrought upon me great troubles and despair, that I cried until I was almost blind, and I had great fear and trembling upon me, that I could not pray, nor hear with profit, but thought it was vain for me to pray, whom God loved not." The devil tempted her to commit suicide, but she was stopped, as she said, by the providence of God, "having a great love to a young infant I had then." The devil continued to rage, but methought at last I heard the Lord saying to my soul, as he did to Paul, "Trust in me, my grace is sufficient for thee." And then I found some comfort. She was further helped by the words of a godly woman who lived near Leeds, so now we can put her, at least originally, near Leeds, and by a minister at York. And then, she continues, "And since I have had so much joy in the promises of God, for proofs of her change of heart and union with Jesus Christ, she spoke of her great love of God, her delight to mingle with other godly folk, and the chief desire of her heart, quote, that God would keep me close by his side, and I have abundance of joy and communion with the Lord, which is more sweet to me than my joy in anything." So the sequence was very close to the one for FP, though the trembling, if you put them both together, is new, as is the extreme stress on fear. In other instances, and I don't have time to explore them here, the meaning of the weeping is different. In these two emotional sequences, the weeping is part of the gesture of despair. It's sad weeping, it's despairing weeping. But in the case of another testimonial, that of AA, tears and weeping were not signs of sadness, but rather of conversion and therefore of joy. These few examples will have to suffice for the emotional community of Henry Walker's gathered church. Only, unfortunately, as I say, they only afford a tiny glimpse of the sensibilities there. Because I want to turn now to a different group, known to the chagrin of its members as the Levelers. Not long before Spiritual Experiences was published, the Levelers came together to seek not comfort, but justice. But this was not an entirely different goal from that of the believers of Henry Walker's church. For the Levelers were sure that justice was equivalent to God's law. The chief propagandists, writers, and spokesmen for this group were John Lilburn, Thomas Prince, Richard Overton, and William Walwyn. So here are some Levelers. But there were quite a few others, less famous, among them some women. Most Levelers were Londoners, and on the whole, the men among them had had experience in civic government. They met in nonconformist churches, much like the one led by Henry Walker, and they joined forces as pamphleteers. Although the group did not command massive popular support, it was well organized and able to take a constructive leadership role. After the execution of Charles I in January of 1649, Lilburn, Walwyn, Prince, and Overton summed up their ideas in their pamphlet, An Agreement of the Free People of England. So this is a political tract, and normally it wouldn't be the place where you would look for emotions, but listen carefully. Speaking as the representatives of the free people of England, they set forth their grievances and determined, quote, to make a right use of that opportunity God has given us to make this nation free and happy, to reconcile our differences, and beget a perfect amity and friendship once more amongst us. Even here, then, in a programmatic statement, we see some emotions highlighted, freedom and happiness. You may say to me, well, freedom isn't an emotion. But I would argue that here, paired as it is with happiness, it does have an emotional force. And then, of course, there's amity and friendship. Somewhat comparable to the testimonies and spiritual experiences was John Lilburn's A Work of the Beast, which he wrote in prison in 1638 after he was arrested, whipped, and pilloried for not taking the oath demanded of him by the Star Chamber. A Work of the Beast's very title declared it to be, quote, very useful for these times, both for the encouragement of the godly to suffer and for the terror and shame of the Lord's adversaries, thus advertising the feelings that it valued, namely suffering for the righteous, and terror and shame for the sinful. In this propaganda piece, Lilburn wrote that on the morning before his whipping, he prayed, quote, to undergo my affliction with joyfulness and courage. Finding consolation in words of Scripture, he, quote, went to my suffering with as willing and joyful a heart as if I had been going to solemnize the day of my marriage with one of the choicest creatures this world could afford. When Lilburn was stripped and bound, he reported, welcome to the cross of Christ. Courage, cheerfulness, merriment, as well as a holy disdain towards his tormentors. These were the emotions he reported feeling as he was whipped through the streets. He focused on the prerogatives God's love gave him rather than on the uncertainty of his faith. He said, I'm one of the chosen. So here you see some of the emotions that he includes in A Work of the Beast. Certainly, consolation in Scripture and joy echoed the feelings in the testimonies of spiritual experiences. But Lilburn repurposed these and other emotions for public issues. He didn't talk about his own sense of sinfulness, but rather associated sin with the oath that had been required of him by the Star Chamber. As he said, quote, this oath I refuted as sinful and unlawful, it being the High Commission oath, with which the prelates ever have and still do butcherly torment, afflict, and undo the dear saints and servants of God. It's also an oath against the law of the land. Again, it's absolutely against the law of God, for that law requires no man to accuse himself. It's also against the practice of Christ, and he concludes, this oath is against the very law of nature, for nature is always a preserver of itself. In another text, William Walwyn's England's Lamentable Slavery, published in 1645, Walwyn begins with a series of grievances rooted in past lists of vices. In my forthcoming book, I show how the virtues and vices were often confounded with emotions. I'll not go into that here, Rather, I'll turn to Walwyn's self-portrayal in this text as a true lover of his country and a faithful friend to that worthy instrument of England's freedom, Lieutenant Colonel Lilburn. So he's referring to another level. Now, we have seen love before, the love that the members of Walker's church felt for God and God felt for them. But here it was redirected, aimed at the country of England and the defenders of England's freedom. Walwyn spoke of his sense of compassion, that is, of fellow feeling for those who suffer. Quote, "Who are they that would be thought Christians and can exempt themselves from suffering with men who suffer? If one suffer, all ought to suffer with that one, even by having a sympathy and fellow feeling of his misery and helping to bear his burden." Let's compare this with the accounts in spiritual experiences, where there was little talk of compassion per se. Even so, those testimonials almost always attested to the comfort that one Christian gave another. The notion of compassion, in fact, had a very long history, beginning at least with Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century. He emphasized compassio, feeling the feelings of others, as necessary for guiding people to salvation. For Walwyn, Lilburn's recent imprisonment mirrored England's bondage. Just as Lilburn had once been a free man, so England had once been a free land. Before the Norman conquest, the people's rights and liberties had been guaranteed to Englishmen. With that conquest, they had to be once again wrestled out of the paws of those kings who by force had conquered the nation, changed the laws, and by strong hand held them in bondage. The struggle had involved much striving and fighting and the shedding of the blood of our ancestors. Now, he wrote, Parliament threatened to revoke those hard-won liberties, and Lilburn, a true hero, had defied it, alleging it to be against your liberty as you were a free-born Englishman to answer to questions against yourself, urging Magna Charta to justify your so doing. Now, the printer of Walwyn's pamphlet put the words Magna Charta or Carta in capital letters, but Walwyn himself considered that document a paltry concession made by one of the conquering kings and abridged by successive monarchs thereafter, often, as he put it, with the unnatural assistance of Parliament to help them. Meanwhile, he said, Parliament occupied itself with ridiculous matters. Here he used wry irony. See how busy they are about the regulating of petty inferior trades and exercising, about the ordering of hunting, who should keep deer, who should not, who should keep a greyhound, who a pigeon house, what punishment for deer stealing, what for every pigeon killed, contrary to law, who should wear cloth of such and such a price, who velvet, gold, and silver, what wages poor laborers should have, and the like, being most of them put on of purpose to divert them from the very thought of freedom. Now, where does this emphasis on political freedom come from? We didn't see it among the people who were joining the church and giving the testimonials for spiritual experiences. But yet the Reformation did have precedent because it emphasized the freedom of the Christian. Freedom was also embedded in the language of town citizenship, which talked of liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities. Already in 1642, Henry Calthrow, who was at that time a recorder of London, collected and commented on what he titled, The Liberties, Usages, and Customs of the City of London. His discussion was organized alphabetically to serve as a handy reference tool to look up the rights and exemptions of London citizenry. 4 years later, Lilburn, writing on behalf of the thwarted attempt of some London citizens to vote for mayor, published in full the Privilege for London issued by King John. He had it printed in Latin, provided an English translation, and added a long commentary. Here he revealed yet again another direct inspiration, the Roman Republic. He put it this way: all free cities, lest their government should become a tyranny and their governors, through ambition and misgovernment, take liberty to oppress and enslave the people to their lusts and will, have in their first constitutions provided that all their officers and magistrates should be elected by votes and approbation of the free people of each city, and no longer to continue other than a year as the annual consuls of Rome. And in the same pamphlet, Lilburn asserted, quote, that all lawful powers reside in the people, for whose good, welfare, and happiness all government and just policies were ordained. That happiness of good government was to provide that good government was to provide was matched by the sorrow that bad government induced. Nor was this purely abstract. Lilburn said, I'm a freeman of England who hath freely hazarded all for the recovery of the common liberty and my country's freedom, and it's no small grief unto me, yea, it lies more heavy upon me than all my other troubles undergone, to see our natural and fundamental laws, rights, and privileges then trodden underfoot. By 1649, after Charles I had been executed, the Levellers declared from their prison in the Tower of London that happiness was their ultimate goal. Quote, since no man is born for himself alone, but obliged by the law of nature, of Christianity, and public society and government to employ our endeavors for the advancement of communitive happiness, of equal concern to others as ourselves. Communitive happiness. Maybe it's not exactly the equivalent of a community of happiness, but the phrase certainly tells us what emotion was most highly valued by the emotional community of the Levellers. It's time for me to sum up. There were many emotional communities in 17th century England. I've hardly scratched the surface by exploring two here from the mid-century. Even so, we can draw some conclusions. These two communities coexisted and may even have overlapped in personnel to some degree. They used a similar emotional language centered on sinfulness, sorrow, comfort, love, joy, and happiness. That language and those emphases had a long history that I've only hinted at. They were emotions that had long been felt and valued, albeit for different reasons, over many generations. Although they coexisted, these same communities were obsessed with different goals. The community of believers in Walker's church were anxious to achieve personal salvation. They felt themselves to be sinful. They despaired, and eventually they found solace and reassurance for themselves. The Levellers saw not themselves, but present state institutions as sinful. They too suffered, not from despair, but rather from the punishments imposed by the government. They were therefore unafraid in the face of their suffering, for it did not signify God's abandonment, but on the contrary, was a form of the imitation of Christ. While the Puritan believers sought comfort in the words of God, the levelers found God's laws not in the Bible, but rather in the rights, liberties, and franchises of Englishmen. While the ultimate emotional goal of the Puritans was individual joy, that of the levelers was communitive happiness. Lest you think that these are the emotions of every group and that everyone always has sought happiness, whether individual or communitive, I would simply remind you that Thomas Hobbes, who was living through the same mid-17th century events, did not include happiness among the terms that he classed as emotions. As for joy, which he did include, it was, according to him, quote, no, this is my this is my paraphrase. The pleasure felt by the mind when it expected or foresaw a delightful end or consequence. It anticipated. It could not be felt about the present. And even if it might have been so felt, it was not terribly important to Hobbes, who was much more obsessed with anxiety than with happiness. But to know more about that, you'll just have to read my book. Thank you.